They've been looking, and they found 1,628 of the hundreds of millions of people in this country. How many?
1,620.
Okay.
If I could try.
Be-Bye Phillip faces MAGA pundit Joe Borelli, who twists himself into logic pretzels to claim voter fraud, a problem repeatedly debunked. Here's the truth. When facts fail, suspicion takes over. Repeating claims doesn't make them real. It's a tactic to confuse and intimidate. This is where democracy meets denial. Abby isn't just debating, she's exposing insecurity dressed as certainty. If you believe democracy depends on facts, hit subscribe. We need clear, informed voices online.
It's one of MAGA's favorite conspiracies that Democrats let immigrants into the country to vote illegally in order to boost votes for liberals.
We have people voting that are not citizens. They just came in.
People that don't speak our language, they're signing them up to vote.
The Democrats are still trying to register illegal aliens.
These people are trying to get them to vote, and that's why they're allowing them to come into our country.
This isn't a mystery. They want illegals to steal elections.
They want them to vote because they're going to vote for the Democrat.
Donald Trump is so obsessed with this. As I mentioned, he regrets not seizing the voting machines in 2020, and his administration has even gotten states to upload voter records to check. So now, apparently, the hunt for evidence is coming up empty, even with those voter records. The New York Times reports that a review shows no widespread fraud. Of the nearly 50 million registrations checked, just 10,000 cases were opened. Now, that is 0.02%. And by open, that might not even be evidence of fraud. It could be that the system that they use mistakenly flagged people who are citizens. In one case in Florida, there was a woman who checked, and she sent over 100 names in. Turned out it was less than a handful that were actually legitimately people who may not have been citizens. She said there's nothing there.
You just pointed out, though, in that monologue, that the federal government is trying to get states to comply with running voter rolls through the SAVE database. 23 states are suing the DOJ to not comply with that. Of the ones that have, yeah, the numbers aren't staggering, but in Alabama, there was 186 out of 3 million. Not a tremendous amount. But if there isn't a tremendous amount, why won't those states just comply?
Because the Constitution gives the power of elections to the states. It's unconstitutional what they're doing.
Why did 148 Democrats vote against a congressional bill to ban non-citizens from voting in D.C. elections? Why can't we just have an open conversation that it's a mainstream part of the Democratic Party to get non-citizens to vote? There are efforts in New York. I'm actually one of the litigants suing against the New York City law to allow non-citizens to vote. There's efforts in D.C. There's efforts in Vermont. There's efforts in 4 or 5 states.
Hold on.
We can't pretend like Democrats aren't trying to do this.
I don't want to mix apples and oranges, because local and state elections are a different ballgame from federal elections. And it used to be that most conservatives would allow states and localities to determine what they want to do in terms of those local elections. But in terms of federal elections, if you're not a citizen, you can't vote. And so far, Trump has now been in office. He spent 4 years the first time. He's been in office for a full year now. They have not come up with any of this purported evidence of voter fraud. Okay. There are indictments all the time. It is not sufficient to change the course of federal elections.
Let's talk about some facts. And the facts are, in a federal election, I used to be an election judge in East Texas, a real judge, Joe. And you could not come in and go on the voter rolls unless you had an ID. Or you couldn't get the card if you didn't have an ID to get the registration card, so you didn't have to show your ID at the thing.
Voter ID.
They also say that can be a little misconceived about what Joe's saying. I'm not saying you're trying to misconceive folks, but in certain municipalities where there are legal residents in big cities, the city council said there's legal residents here that pay city taxes, and maybe we should allow, let's vote on it and see, to vote in a local election. By no means a federal election. And that's where you saw Republicans take that little piece of what some local municipality has done and said, oh my God, they're going to let illegals vote outside the elections. That's why this is coming down that way.
Yeah, I think that you're talking about things that could happen, things that might happen, things that people have proposed, as opposed to what's happening right now. And the evidence says that there aren't people who are undocumented immigrants voting in these elections in any way that could actually impact the election. That's been a myth that they have, the Republicans have pushed for years.
But we wouldn't need a myth, or we wouldn't need evidence if we just allowed these 23 states to comply with the federal rule, run the voter rolls through the database. Again, Alabama, 186 people. I don't think that's massive fraud,
Joe,
but that's enough people.
Why? Yeah, I mean, why? Because you guys are in search of something that there's been no evidence exists to the degree that you think that it exists, and it's fair for states to say, no, we're not going to hand over information about every single person who's on the voter rolls in our state. Elections are federalized for a reason.
So do we think because a cop writes 2 tickets, there's only 2 cars speeding down the highway?
I'm sorry?
Do we think if a cop writes 2 tickets that only 2 cars are speeding down the highway? No. Those are the ones that just happen to get caught. Again, there's a solution. We don't have to talk about this hypothetically. We could have the states comply with the DOJ.
Well, if so, why in the history of this country have Republicans never been able to prove widespread voter fraud?
You can go on the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, and
Heritage Foundation vote map, 1,620 cases.
That is a good point, because the Heritage Foundation has been searching. They've been looking, and they found
1,620 cases.
Of the hundreds of millions of people in this country, how many?
1,620.
Okay.
If I could chime in on this, because I do have...
Let's slow this moment down even further, because this is where the entire narrative doesn't just weaken, it collapses under its own weight. Abby Phillip points to the Heritage Foundation, a conservative institution that has spent years actively searching for voter fraud, motivated politically and financially to uncover it. They weren't neutral observers, they were looking for confirmation. And after combing through hundreds of millions of votes across cycles and states, they arrived at 1,620 cases. That number isn't alarming, it's clarifying. It represents a vanishingly small fraction of 1%. So small that it cannot alter outcomes, cannot distort representation, and cannot justify the panic that's been manufactured around it. And even that number isn't a clean count of intentional wrongdoing. Many cases involve clerical errors, outdated registrations, or people who moved and made a mistake. Ordinary human friction inside a massive democratic system, not criminal conspiracies. Yet these imperfections are inflated into proof of a stolen democracy. That exaggeration isn't accidental. During Trump's first term, this theory wasn't just discussed on cable news. It was stress-tested by the full weight of federal power. Election integrity commissions were created. States were pressured to turn over data. Voter rolls were scrutinized. Investigators were sent out with a clear expectation to find something, anything, that could justify the claim. And after all of that effort, the conclusion was unmistakable. There was no widespread fraud. When fraud did appear at all, it was isolated, statistically insignificant, and, in an uncomfortable twist, sometimes committed by Republicans themselves. That contradiction never survives the soundbite. This is where the psychological layer becomes unavoidable. Figures like Joe Borelli aren't responding to evidence. They're responding to a loss of certainty. As turnout expands, as demographics shift, and as elections become more representative, anxiety replaces confidence. Instead of adapting ideas to a changing electorate, legitimacy itself is questioned. Fear gets rebranded as vigilance. Suspicion gets sold as responsibility. And doubt becomes a substitute for proof. Now zoom out and look at the structure. The same voices warning about mass voter fraud are consistently opposed to early voting, mail-in ballots, automatic registration, and expanded access. Not because these systems are unsafe. Repeated studies show they are secure, but because they work. They bring more eligible citizens into the process. And in a real democracy, participation isn't a threat. It's the entire point. This is where democracy meets denial. Instead of addressing real problems, rising costs, healthcare access, education, infrastructure, stability, political energy is redirected toward imaginary crimes. The politics of punishment replaces the politics of solutions. Hypotheticals are treated as emergencies. Fear becomes justification. and people are slowly conditioned to accept fewer rights in exchange for a promise of security that isn't backed by reality. What Abby Phillip is doing here isn't just correcting a statistic. She's restoring proportion. She's reminding viewers that democracy doesn't collapse because of rare errors. It collapses when bad faith actors convince people that reality itself can't be trusted. One side insists on evidence, scale, and institutional truth. The other insists that disbelief should override data, even after every audit is complete. One side trusts participation. The other fears what participation reveals. So let's be clear and grounded. Widespread voter fraud is not real. It has been investigated, audited, litigated, and debunked at every level. What is real is a political strategy that depends on convincing people otherwise. And that distinction between evidence and fear, between democracy and denial, is the line that cannot be blurred without consequence.
If I could chime in on this, because I do have some history in this. When I started working for Mike Pence, he was overseeing the Election Integrity Commission, which was stood up in the White House the first time Donald Trump was elected. I think a very important piece of this conversation, before I get to my point there, is the difference between state elections, where there are local elections that in some cases there have been efforts to get undocumented migrants the ability to vote. Federal, there is virtually no evidence of fraud, to the point where I had to walk into the West Wing and present the evidence to the president's team of we're folding this commission. We found virtually nothing. It was such a low number.
Next for us, though.
And this is where the debate effectively ends. Alyssa Farah Griffin, a former top aide to Vice President Mike Pence, who worked inside the Trump White House, says it clearly and without hesitation. There is virtually no voter fraud happening in the United States, not at a scale that matters, not at a level that could change outcomes, and not after years of searching. That matters because Alyssa Farah Griffin isn't speaking from theory. She was there when the Trump administration launched its so-called Election Integrity Commission. She was there when states were pressured, data was reviewed, and claims were tested behind closed doors. And after all of that, the conclusion was unavoidable. The evidence simply wasn't there. And watch what happens next. Abby Phillip moves the conversation forward. There's no extended rebuttal from Joe Borelli, no new proof, no counter-argument. Because once verified reality enters the discussion, the narrative collapses. Silence becomes the answer. This is the pattern we've seen again and again from MAGA figures like Joe Borelli, a relentless search for a solution to a problem that does not exist. Not because they expect to find fraud, but because the search itself serves a purpose. It creates doubt. It feeds grievance. It redirects public frustration away from real problems and toward imagined enemies. For years, Republican leaders and commentators have repeated the same claim, that non-citizens are voting, that elections are being stolen, that Democrats secretly want undocumented immigrants to decide outcomes. And yet, there is one thing they can never point to, a single Democratic leader saying this is the goal. Not Joe Biden, not Barack Obama, not any Democratic official, because it isn't real. This is the contradiction at the heart of the MAGA narrative. Billions of ballots have been analyzed. Federal and state investigations were launched under Republican administrations. Courts reviewed the claims and rejected them. Even insiders like Alyssa Farah Griffin have acknowledged the truth. And still, the story continues. Not because it's true, but because it's politically useful. This isn't about election integrity, it's about punishment politics. When a movement has no answers for improving lives, wages, healthcare, housing, stability, it turns to suspicion as a substitute for policy. Imaginary crimes replace real solutions. Fear replaces governance. What Abby Phillip and the rest of the panel are doing isn't dismissing concerns. It's grounding them in evidence. They're reminding viewers that facts matter. Proportion matters. Truth matters. Democracy doesn't fail because of rare human error. It fails when people are taught to distrust reality itself. So here's the clear takeaway. Widespread voter fraud is a myth. It has been investigated, audited, and debunked at every level. What is real is the damage caused when figures like Joe Borelli continue to push that myth despite the evidence. This isn't a partisan judgment, it's a democratic one. And the choice is simple: fear built on fiction or confidence grounded in facts. Democracy only survives if we choose the latter.